Thank you, everyone, for showing up tonight. Thank you for showing up in so many different ways in this community. We're here tonight to welcome back to our midst Nora Ness. You give her a hand? Yeah. It's so wonderful to to see the arc of your work, Nora, and we want to thank you for coming back. Nora, of course, was a Jefferson Scholar at UVA, got her BA there, and then to the Batten School, Master's in Public Policy. And while still there as a student at UVA, I think was starting to work at NBC 29 at the local NBC affiliate here, TV News. And then went to CNN in New York and was covering the Unite the Right rally for CNN. Yes, and it was during this time she's gone on to working for CNN, has covered the war in Ukraine and at the beginning of the Russian invasion. She's written for CNN, for Vice, for the Washington Post. And she published her first book actually last year. This isn't even her first book that we're looking at here tonight. Just last year, a book, graphic memoir, co-written with a Syrian journalist. She just this morning, 2 pieces. Check out pointer.org, the journalism site, to see her op-ed where she's reflecting on the journalistic ethics of compensating sources. So that's just this morning. Also Teen Vogue, where there's an excerpt of her book this morning as well. So we're going to hear about 24 Hours in Charlottesville, an oral history of the stand against white supremacy, which is her current book, second book. Today is its official Beacon Press publication day. This is the launch, and we're doing it right here. Yeah. Yeah, so we're so fortunate to have Nora back with us, and we'll talk about what some of her thought processes were for writing this book. A lot of ink has been spilled about Charlottesville's 2017 Summer of Hate. And we've heard from journalists, we've heard from the police, we've heard from politicians, from preachers, from professors. But of course, the white supremacists themselves have received a lot of attention. And what Nora's book gives us is an account that amplifies the voices of racial justice activists here. And here, do you want to ask?
Yeah, I actually would love to acknowledge some of the people that are here today who contributed to the book. And so I'd like to ask Katrina Turner and Rosia Parker over here in the front row to stand up and say hello. And to also thank them for their work in this community. And then if there's anyone else here, I see a couple of you that spoke to me for this book and you feel like you want to, raise your hand or stand up and say hello if you're quoted in the book. Yes, I see a couple. Okay. And then I'm interested in this one. Who was here present in 2017, the summer of 2017, who would have spoken to me for the book had I asked you? So I think that just goes to show I could have written this book 1,000,000 times over with 1,000,000 different interviews with people in Charlottesville. It just would have taken decades if I had interviewed all of you. And so it's not personal, but also this is just a small cross-section of the people that were here and working that summer.
Wonderful. All right. Well, I wonder if you can tell us, Nora, what for you was the biggest lesson, the biggest takeaway from your book, from writing your book?
I knew what happened in Charlottesville. I knew what happened the whole summer of hate. I knew what happened on Friday night with the Torch March. I knew what happened on Saturday. I'd been watching the news and since then was in town for a lot of it. What I didn't fully grasp, even having been in the room in a lot of these conversations, was the extent to which we knew what was going to happen. The activists, especially the racial justice activists, the community members who were actually doing this organizing work, administrators at UVA Hospital, people who were actually out there looking for intelligence, knew that this was going to happen, knew that they were going to come here, that knew that they were going to be violent. And I'm saying white supremacists, white nationalists, alt-right, the neo-Nazis. And we'll talk about that language and those terms and what that all means in a little bit, I think. But this was not a surprise. And I think sometimes it's spoken about in the national media as this crazy thing that happened. It was just a beautiful Saturday morning. And then, oh my gosh, did you see what happened in Charlottesville? And I mean, that people in town were saying that. I mean, in Charlottesville, the farmers market was open on August 12th, 2017. Okay, and yet at the same time, we knew this was going to happen. And activists, especially Black women, were telling people this was going to happen. And leaders at the university level, the state level, the city level, were not able to respond in a way that prevented violence and death from occurring. And I think, spoiler alert, that's really the point of the whole book. Not in an intentional way, that's just once I finished my research, what really came through out of this was how much warning there was. There's a part in the book, and this is like a little bit graphic, the whole book is a little bit graphic, but beforehand, activists had discovered white nationalists posting memes that said Black Lives Matter, using a car as a vehicle, as a weapon. We knew this was going to happen, and it happened anyway.
Okay, all right. That's a pretty big lesson to take. What was the biggest surprise?
I think maybe twofold. On one hand, I was surprised at how much was known. I was surprised at the level of intelligence that was really gathered. There's a lot of different examples of this in the book, but one of them is the UVA hospital. The UVA Medical Center actually had some of the best intelligence going into the weekend and the summer because the director of emergency management had military background. And so he was using entirely public source information that any one of our city councilors or leaders could have used. But he writes in the book, and I'll actually read you a small part of this. This is Tom Berry talking to me. This is his voice. He says, "It wasn't hard to do through the unclassified network. It was pretty easy to see that people were interested in violence. It wasn't just likely. To me, it was more imminent based on a lot of the websites that I was looking at. And so from that, I felt like it was pretty easy to determine something's going to happen." He goes on to describe decompressing the hospital, moving elective surgeries, having to tell people who've waited for their hip replacements for months that, sorry, we actually have to bump you. In case something happens, we want to have enough beds in the property. They made plans with the National Guard to land Black Hawks on Charlottesville High School field as the contingency planning. They figured if there was open combat in the streets of Charlottesville, and if they had too many shooting victims, they would have to airlift some of them to other area hospitals. This is weeks before. So there's a meeting that I recount in the book where these individuals went to Teresa Sullivan, the president of the university at the time, to these planning meetings and shared all of this. And specifically, we're using the term mass casualty. And this is how Tom Berry remembers it. "I really explained how we were taking those actionable steps to prepare ourselves, decompressing the hospital in terms of ICU beds, and I can tell that she, Teresa Sullivan, really didn't want that to be communicated out. And I think in her mind, she thought that it would make people very fearful. She didn't say those words specifically, but the look I saw in her eyes was, Tom, what you just briefed to me, I really don't want that to be our message out because I think it's going to scare people. I then spoke to President Sullivan, who was very forthright, spent a lot of time with me, and her quotes are all throughout this book in a way that she hasn't previously spoken about her decisions and what went into her own experience of this time. And she remembers that same conversation very differently, as is the case across the book. People remember these things differently. Her recollection is, and so she's quoting from another one of her advisors, had told me that they were prepared for it. But he also said to me, we do regular drills for this and so on. They all seemed quite confident that they were ready to take care of it. But also, when he spoke of mass casualty, I was thinking, more along the lines of things that we would see at football games, where you'd have people who had heat stroke, heat exhaustion, stuff like that, the occasional heart attack or stroke. I didn't actually think of it in terms of orchestrated violence. And then that speaks to the breakdown in communication. And that's even within UVA. I mean, that's UVA Medical Center and the UVA president. And so I think I was just surprised that even with the communication, there were that many breakdowns.
Wow, that's a very revealing window, just that vignette right there. Okay. Other surprises that.
I mean, sometimes I was just surprised what people were willing to say to me. I think sometimes it's 5 or 6 years later. Most of these interviews were done 5 years later, and so I think people have had a time and a chance to reflect. A lot of people have moved on from being in town, which I think helps. But I had an interesting moment with Governor McAuliffe, who I was speaking to for the book, and his quotes are throughout the book as well. He spoke in a very candid way that he hasn't previously. And I wanted to kind of specifically get at some of the pieces of his book that didn't always dovetail with fact. And so I asked him at one point specifically about activating the National Guard, which he did well before it was announced publicly. And this is how he described it to me, a reporter. Now, we tried to do this secretly. I wanted to make sure we had all the assets down there, but the last thing I wanted was CNN to say, Terry McAuliffe, the governor of Virginia, has called a state of emergency, is sending the National Guard. Because all that's going to do is be like Woodstock. Everyone would say, ooh, I got to get to Charlottesville. We almost got caught. We didn't lie to the press, but we did skate it a little bit and said, well, we have training exercises going on, which did happen to be true. But the truth is we were moving everybody to Charlottesville. And I'm a reporter, I'm a member of the press. I didn't love that, and I told him that. Don't lie to the press is a general rule of thumb I have.
Wow. So this is very revealing. So what, in talking with these various figures, each had their own different roles to play. How do you prioritize, or how do you make the decisions about which voices to include and how to prioritize, the order of the narration? Because as you've said, there are, many different accounts coming from different perspectives. So what do you do? I mean, and this kind of calls upon your work as a reporter too. You have to do this. So how did that come to the fore in this project?
I mean, it was difficult because there are different memories in kind of a legitimate way. People remember one single day 5 years ago very differently. And especially if that's a traumatic memory, that's going to be remembered very differently or not at all by different people. So it's not always that people are trying to obfuscate or are trying to lie, or, they might genuinely misremember something, or there is no one objective truth of how something went that I can find as someone who wasn't in people's heads at that moment. So I think the goal with the book was really to fact check everything on the page. And what I mean by that is if something was recounted differently by different people, I put them all there so that you can read the different accounts and where they differ, and then you can decide who you want to believe. The original book was 4 times as long. It was this big. Part of that was because I wanted to put everyone's quotes in and show, look, 7 people told me the same exact thing, so it must be true. Whereas that's not really fun to read when you read the same thing over and over and over again 7 times. So for the most part, everything in the book, if it's just presented, is true, and I fact-checked that. It's where there's these discrepancies that I call out, and you can see those within the book.
Did you, were people by and large willing to be candid? Did you have, and without mentioning names, did you have some people who refused to talk, or, would rather not?
Yeah, that took a lot of convincing. There were some that needed some convincing. And there were some people that didn't speak to me. I mean, the chief of police and the city manager declined to speak to me. Fair point. Those who were there as of that day. We've gone through 6, maybe, since then.
One now.
Yeah, but so that was definitely disappointing. And then there were other people for whom it would have been, and people who did speak to me, incredibly traumatic to relive this. And because of the oral history and because of the way I'm writing the book, it is very immersive, and I'm asking people to relive not just what happened in general, but the specifics of what they heard and smelled and saw and the heat of that day. And that is hard. And so there were people who said yes and who trusted me through that. And then there were people who declined respectfully. And one of the real riches of just archival material here is that the Sines versus Kessler trial had just concluded when I was writing this book. And so those transcripts make up some of the book. So there were people who didn't speak to me directly, who had given testimony under oath, and those are incorporated here as well, so that they didn't have to relive those memories.
Great. Can you speak to us about your work as a journalist? Both when you were starting out, here in Charlottesville doing local news, and then moving on to a national outlet, to CNN, and then how your coverage of events has changed. How has your experience covering Charlottesville during the Summer of Hate, how has that been reflected in your ongoing work?
That's a good question. I think there's this line in a way of like where you're allowed to take a position on something that gets really fuzzy when you start talking about fascism and white nationalism and white supremacy. And I think as a 21-year-old reporter at NBC 29, I didn't have the understanding of that and the need to call out fascism and white supremacy. I mean, just Jason Kessler, we called a local blogger, which is not untrue. This is not false, but that is not the most true way of describing who he was, even at that time before August 12th. And so that's something I'm very conscious of moving forward, of where we are drawing that line in terms of what is neutrality, what is objectivity, does objectivity, neutrality exist? I mean, this is a larger conversation within journalism right now. And sometimes it's very obvious. If I'm covering a political race between 2 opponents, I'm not going to endorse one of them, obviously, right? If there is, it is August 12th, Charlottesville, someone has died at the hands of neo-Nazis, okay, I can say that's a tragedy. But there's a whole lot of gray area in between that where we have to be calling out these forces, and there is a constitutional requirement that we do so, and that the press does have the freedom to do so, which we're not able to do in a lot of other countries. But where is that line? And that's something that I grapple with a lot. That's something that a lot of people in my field grapple with, and a lot of people like you have called us out on repeatedly, and that, needs to be done. This is something that I encountered at CNN a lot. I remember in the early days of the Trump administration, we had a conversation about the child separation policy. And we would never take a position on an immigration law. We would never take a position on an immigration policy broadly construed. But kidnapping children and putting them into cages felt like something we could probably take a stand on, but not necessarily. Like, this was a big conversation. Like, are we allowed to say that this is cruel and we're kidnapping children and putting them in cages? Like, is that, and this was a, I mean, weeks long conversation that we never really landed anywhere. It was all just kind of gray. And if our job is to tell the truth and our job is to tell the most true version of events, there's an old maxim in journalism school: don't cover the Montgomery bus boycott like a transportation story. It's true, but not the point.
And I think you said it at one point that you had this realization that this was no longer about a statue.
Yeah.
I mean, can you talk about that process? I mean, that's a great description. Don't cover the Montgomery bus boycott like a transportation.
Yeah.
When did you make that pivot? In your own understanding.
I think it was gradual. And that's a line that Chris Suarez, who's a reporter at the Daily Progress here and a friend of mine, says in the book, kind of borrowing from him a bit. He says, I very quickly realized this wasn't about statues. And for a long time, we were covering this like, there's two sides, there's both sides of an argument about if we should keep these statues in town, recontextualized in place, the Blue Ribbon Commission meetings that I was at. And there's a point at which the conversation needs to change to white nationalists who are armed and saying they want to foment violence in our streets are coming. What do we do with that? And I don't have an answer to this, but like, where do you shift from one to the next? And getting that wrong is what leads to people dying.
And can you say a bit more about conversations that you had with your journalism colleagues about this? Kind of both, in that moment here. I mean, you were a local reporter at first for part of this, right, in 2017, and then started working for CNN during this year. Yes. Yeah. I mean. Okay, so yeah, so you had that perspective of coming, from, from doing a local beat, as it were. This was the local beat, you know what I mean? And then coming in from national, to cover a nationally significant event, What were some of the conversations that you had with colleagues in both places about what was going on and how to cover it?
I think the big difference there was just the context and understanding of the months that had led up to the book. The event. And in the book, it's funny, it's called 24 Hours in Charlottesville. We don't get to August 12th until the last third of this book. It's kind of a misnomer because we really do speak about the entire context of the summer and then the night of August 11th, which was such a prominent night in the American kind of consciousness now. But the problem is with national media, and I have done this, is you parachute into a story and you don't know the context. At the beginning of the war in Ukraine, which you had mentioned, I went to Ukraine for CNN and was there at the beginning of the invasion. And I know how to produce news, and I know I'm good at my job, but I'm not an expert in Ukrainian foreign policy. And so you really have to defer to local leaders. And the only way to do that job well is to have local fixers, local journalists, local people on the ground who have been doing the work, and to be humble enough to go in and say, okay, like, what do I need to know and what is the story? So I think that's where national news can be problematic, because you're going into these stories that you don't know anything about. And then you're the ones responsible for framing them to the world. And on a practical level, most often you have not slept, you have not eaten, you're running on like bad drugstore coffee, and you're trying to report this story that you have no idea about. And so local news is incredibly important. It's underfunded and will all go away soon. And it's not good. I have nothing hopeful to say at the end of that.
But, conversations with your colleagues, with journalistic colleagues, what can you say about that?
I think we got to once President Trump made his kind of there was violence on both sides comments, that kind of gave us the out to say, well, we can't be saying the same thing as that. So we're going to stop saying the both sides thing that we've been saying. And I think a lot of the conversations with colleagues were trying to explain that context and trying to explain how we had gotten here, explain the realities of that this was not just this moment that popped up out of nowhere, but was part of a very long history, not only in this town, but in this country.
And you mentioned the kind of both sidesism that we heard from the highest levels of government, and this is kind of been the lodestar of journalism, for quite some time too, right? To kind of to look at all sides. I mean, once you are kind of positioning yourself, right, as a journalist. Now I'm speaking, as a journalist, as you're positioning yourself with respect to the, various figures in a story, what, how do you talk about advocacy in journalism? I mean, where's the line here, and how do you measure yourself as a as a reporter, given this situation?
It's an incredibly fine line and a dangerous place to wade into because you risk losing your credibility. You risk being seen as an advocate or as an advocacy agent or an activist. Whereas there's a reason that journalists are supposed to be truthful, impartial, this traditional idea of balance that has now gotten a little bit messed up, as we've discussed. But you run the risk of putting yourself in a different category and losing your credibility. And that's something that just frankly I've thought a lot about. What does that look like for me in my own career? Because I am a journalist and I am a trained journalist. I've been a journalist for many years. I see this book as a work of journalism. But I also am not going to sit here and say, well, both sides, should be discussed equally and we should interview folks we should equally treat both sides. What is it that you say? You have a good pithy. There's no two sides.
There's no both sides when one side is genocide.
There's no, yes.
Yeah.
It rhymes, but it's also true.
Yeah. Well, kind of given that, what challenges does this book, 24 Hours in Charlottesville, what challenges does it present to the field of journalism?
I mean, one of the big criticisms I got of the book in the very beginning is that I did not interview white nationalists or white supremacists. And that was a very intentional decision that foreclosed opportunities to be published by bigger name publishers, frankly, who wanted me to go out and tell both sides of the story. And what was so incredible about my publisher, Beacon, and the people who were around me in this process was that they saw the value in not platforming white supremacists and neo-Nazis. This is a body of research that I am not an expert in, and a lot of other people are, including you. But the basic idea is that these people already have their ideas out there. There are plenty of sources you can go to tell that story without making them feel important, without making them glad that you're interviewing them, without giving them an opportunity for propaganda, without giving them an opportunity to say, oh, well, we were interviewed for this book, and I also have no interest in speaking to white nationalists, just spending my time that way. But there's the platforming of white supremacists and of neo-Nazis is something that, as an industry, we needed to really look at. And there isn't always a right answer, and maybe there's times when, I'm not going to say that. I don't know. Maybe there's times when different choices could be made, but I think you have to really look at this carefully. And for my purposes, for this book, I had court records, I had videos, I had depositions, I had the independent report of both the state and of the local government. I had the independent report. I had plenty of ways to tell that story without talking to them.
What other lessons for journalism does this book contribute?
I think the other big one, and you had mentioned this earlier, is this idea of compensating sources. And it is prohibited in almost every circumstance for a journalist to pay a source. The reason for this is that there's an idea it would create a conflict of interest. You could want to protect people. It could incentivize someone to lie to you. We see this a lot in foreign conflicts. If you're offering money, then all of a sudden people are going to come out of the woodwork with some crazy stories they want to tell you in exchange for cash. That's all true. At the same time, I am asking for hours upon hours of labor from people, especially marginalized people, especially people who don't have hours off of work to hang out and talk about the most traumatic moment of their life, after which they may need more hours to recover. And the people that we ask for that unpaid labor from are often people of color, often women of color. And so, again, if my goal as a journalist is to tell the most true, most accurate story, then the way of accomplishing that, paradoxically, is to be willing to compensate people for their time and not also be a drain on resources for this community, and not to profit off of the stories of trauma of people who have been through this. And so my policy for the book was that I would compensate people for their time, not for the information, not for their story. I wasn't going to assign a dollar value to your trauma or your trauma. I paid the same hourly rate. I rounded up to an hour, the closest hour, even if they were like 15 minutes over. And I compensated activists, survivors, community members. I did not compensate politicians, public figures, bigger name journalists. And then there was this kind of gray area in between where there were folks who I knew, frankly, didn't need the money, but who fell into those categories, and I offered to donate that back to other survivors or to a charity of their choice. That's how the book is as accurate as it is. And I think there's an ethical question to expecting so much unpaid labor from folks that then theoretically I and the publisher would be monetarily profiting off of. And so the advance went almost entirely to survivors and to folks I interviewed. And then a lot of I don't know that we're going to make any royalties, but if we ever did, then that would be redistributed as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And this seems like a good time to mention that you've probably seen the little announcements that were on each seat with the QR code for Congregate Seville. Wave to our friends over here. Hi, Congregate. Thank you. They were on the front lines during the Summer of Hate, doing community organizing, doing nonviolent direct action. And they are still on the front lines helping our community, and specifically that this is a fundraiser. Tonight's event is also a fundraiser for survivors. There are still survivors of August 11 and 12, who need our help. So thank you, Congregate, for being there, for members of our community who need this, and for all the work that you do. But did want to call attention to that.
And we'll hear a few words from Congregate at the end, just about exactly how this process works. It is a very low barrier process for folks to get money. So just like physically get the money in their account. And so I have a list of, I think I'm up to 10 names of folks specifically who I know need help, and that is for therapy bills. There's a lot of people who were talking to me and broke down. Multiple people had full panic attacks on the phone with me. Most people cried. And a lot of people said to me, oh, this is so nice. You know, I've never actually been to therapy, but this feels like it. And I would say, no, I'm not a mental health professional. Like, I please seek help, not from me, because I definitely can't help you. I'm going to go talk to my therapist later. And so please help these people get therapy, and also pay for, you know, all of their other medical bills, and things like that.
Absolutely. Well, you know, speaking of trauma, what do you have to say about trauma-informed journalism? What does that look like? I mean, you've been in Syria too, or you've covered, or in Turkey, okay, yeah. Covering I guess refugees from the Syrian civil war. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
And also the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I mean, so you've been in places, in addition to, you know, Charlottesville, where there is active trauma going on. You know, what does it mean to do trauma-informed journalism?
I've been really trying to think about that as like its own discrete thing, because we talk a lot about trauma and a lot about journalism, and we talk about, you know, trauma-informed teachers and things like that. So I've been trying to think about it in this like trauma-informed journalism way. A big part of it is respecting the agency of the people that you're speaking with. At the beginning of all my interviews, I try to say, you are in charge. The power dynamic is such that you are in charge, and I am asking you questions that you can answer or not answer. Not for politicians. For politicians, they have to answer what I ask them. But for other people, and say, you know, this is a platform for you to share your story, and then not re-traumatizing people unnecessarily, being respectful of the weight of what you are asking from someone, and being able to give breaks, being able to, get minute-long breaks or week-long breaks. They can stop at any time. Once you've consented to the interview, you have not locked yourself into every single question, and letting people just reorienting that power dynamic that sometimes exists with journalists coming in and asking questions.
Great. I really appreciate that. I've had the experience just as an activist of feeling almost ambushed, you know, by journalists, and the not being cognizant, you know, on the part of journalists, you know, not being cognizant of what it is they're even asking, you know, or the vulnerability that is there, you know, can be re-traumatizing for folks who have gone through this, you know. I wanted to, you know, kind of pivot to some larger questions. We are here under the auspices of the UVA Karsh Institute of Democracy's Memory Project, which I direct. And so I wanted to kind of have a conversation about, again, what 24 Hours, what this book has to say about the status of democracy. You know, what did you learn in doing this project and doing your reporting?
Democracy is supposed to be about listening to citizens. And that is something that broke down at every level in the summer of hate. And I think when we're talking about listening to people, it's not just the people already in power. It's not just the people who already seem to like have the answers. I think there is this sense continually when I was talking to people that there was some other entity that was going to like take care of things. Like, oh, well, we're going to figure this out. But then, you know, the city council was deferring to the lawyers. The lawyers were two guys in a room. The court was trying to make the court case based on the Constitution, but figured that the activists would figure out other things. Certain groups of activists were making decisions without consulting other groups of activists. There was a lot of questions about who was going to protest which event, for example. There were a lot of conversations about one narrow sliver of the conversation and assuming other people would take care of the rest of it. And there was a lot of this, I don't know if this is how this is gonna go over. There's a meme from Spider-Man of all the Spider-Mans pointing at each other. Okay, I'm getting some nods. That's what this felt like, where everyone was thinking that someone else was going to like take care of it. And it's like, no, you're the guy. Like, there's no other adult in the room who is gonna step in. And I mean, we have the governor on speakerphone with Brian Moran, who is Secretary of, Emergency Public Safety. Public Safety. I forgot his exact title, but he's all over the book, and he was a big member. But we have people communicating via speakerphone. We have the entire police force of both Charlottesville, Albemarle, the state police, not being able to talk to each other on the radios because someone didn't sync them that day. We have people in the book. There's a story of Jason Kessler at 5 p.m. on Friday, August 11th, calling the UVA Police Department and saying, hey, I'm going to have a march tonight. And they said, great, where's it going to be? And he said, well, we're going to start over here. We're going to walk around here, but don't worry, we're going to stay on the sidewalks. It's not going to be violent. The officer, the 911 dispatcher officer says, okay, great. That makes it up the ranks a little bit, but not really. 2 hours later, Teresa Sullivan's on the lawn, and a student comes over to her and says, hey, have you heard about this thing people are talking about? There's going to be a torch march tonight. And she says, what? This is the first I've ever heard of it. No one told her that Jason Kessler called the UVA Police Department to report that the march was going to happen. But then, even then, she says in the book to me, well, I thought Jason Kessler was telling me the truth about being nonviolent because he's a UVA grad and we have the honor code. So there always has to be, there's a sense, and I don't know, maybe this is also like me as a younger person, but like, I'm like, there's an adult in the room that's gonna take care of this. Like, I'll figure out some of it, but like, there has to be a grown-up here who's going to fix this. And it's like, no, we're all just doing the thing. Like, we're all just here, and if you're not doing it, no one else probably is. And there's not some secret grown-up adult thing that's gonna fix it. Like, it's us, it's you and me. It's like we have to do the thing in order to prevent. That was the least eloquent way I could have put that, but you get what I mean.
Yeah, being a grown-up in the room. I remember thinking during that summer, well, if I know these things, little old me, I'm just a simple country professor. If me, just a lay activist person, if I know these things about what these people are planning, then, I mean, doesn't everyone? It turned out that was not the case, or even when, we tried to inform others that, that was not that. So, okay, so if democracy is about listening to citizens, and you're saying here that you felt that, folks weren't always listened to, what about our memory of events? I mean, part of kind of forming narratives, that we tell one another, that are, kind of told publicly, has to do with, those, listening to stories and kind of marshaling them, in a certain way or shape, that then informs public discussion, deliberation. I mean, again, democracy, right? I mean, so what? How does this book revise the memory of Unite the Right or Summer of Hate, in Charlottesville? And how does it intervene in conventional narratives and, in larger narratives?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think in a way it's like triangulating all the different points of connection and then creating this story. You talk to two people, you get one idea, you add a third, you have some more points of connection. And when you start talking to 100 people and all of the court documents and court cases and independent reviews and paperwork, then you end up getting something approximating the truth. But memories are fallible, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't listen to them. Oral history is an indigenous tradition. This is a tradition that has been around as the main way of communicating truth, history, family stories, community stories. and warnings of how to prevent things from happening again. This is a tradition that we are borrowing from Indigenous people. And there's a reason that oral history, I think, is really powerful, and that's because it is relying on people's memories to speak to what they experienced in those days and in those moments. And we have to listen when people speak, and not with the caveat of, where did you go to college, and what degree do you have, and what do you do? But what have you experienced? What has your lived experience taught you? And a lot of those people with the most wisdom are not the people who went to the top tier schools and to our politicians.
Okay. All right. So what intervention does this make into conventional narratives, whether about Summer of Hate, or even we can even jump larger on a larger scale, the status of democracy. What sort of intervention does this offer? Does your book offer?
I think on the local level, I would hope that you all read it and have a different understanding of what happened. But I think there's also this sense of, like, this is possible to do. And with that, I mean, coming into this project, I was looking for someone else. I was trying to do research and figure out who had done this already, who had put together all the puzzle pieces, because I certainly wasn't going to try to do it. And it didn't exist. And I kind of realized that maybe it could be me that tried to do this with some other very smart people. And I think there's an inclination to say, oh, well, we'll never get to the bottom of it. Oh, well, we'll never know what really happened. Like, oh, there's water under the bridge. And it's like, no, a person died and people were gravely injured, and we can get to the bottom of this. And we may not have the most absolute truth ever, because it is based on memory, but you can't escape memory. And even for future incidents like this, or for future experiences, it's only by fully metabolizing and understanding what happened that we can prevent something else from happening.
Right. Well, maybe now we can kind of turn things toward our audience here, so that we can have some conversation here. And we have a couple of folks from Congregate here who are going to be our runners with our microphones here to just open this up. And if I can just say that, please, ask a question. A question starts with who, what, where, why, when. It is one sentence. Okay. I'm sure we all have a lot to say, but we can say that later, if we have, kind of longer reflections. So please, if we can direct a question to the author.
So you may have answered this earlier with the lack of communication among parties, but in your interviews, did you come across the reason for the curious inaction of the police during this? And I'm thinking about one specific episode where the clergy activists were on the southeast corner of the steps to the park trying to block a unofficial entrance of the groups into the park, and they were assaulted. And there was a group of state police just standing there in the street as this was happening. So I wondered if you had any sort of, in your interviews, insight as to that particular inaction.
Yeah, so that scene is talked about from a couple of different perspectives in the book. And essentially, it's this line of clergy that were arm in arm, were at the corner of the park, and they were assaulted. They were physically assaulted and verbally assaulted. And there's a moment in the book where some of the clergy turn to each other and say, oh, no one's getting arrested today. There is that's not, this is a different ball game. This is no longer, oh, we might get arrested in civil disobedience. This is, no one is getting arrested today. The big thing that I wish I could have done in this book more was interview more law enforcement. They shockingly, not shockingly, won't talk to me or anyone. It's not in their interest to. There's a lot of conversation about this idea of a stand down order, which is a phrase that's been used a lot. Was there some kind of, and I've heard it described as a conspiracy theory, but I've also heard it described as just factually, like they stood down, so was there a stand down order? I think I get squirrely about that term because I don't think there was necessarily, I have not uncovered proof of a specific order. But the orders that were given over the course of the day, for the most part, was don't inflame tensions, don't make it worse. And there was a very real concern about escalating tensions. So we pull out a gun, you're gonna pull out a gun, we're gonna end up in a bloodbath. And that is the argument given for why the police didn't intervene more than they did. But they stood there and they watched it happen over and over and over again, and then over again some more. And proof after proof, in any form of proof you want, including the Virginia State Police After Action Report that was prepared by the National Association of Chiefs of Police or something like that. I mean, this is not me saying this. Like, the police failed. And they did not keep people safe. And I don't know that we're ever going to fully have great answers about that. But you're going to see it again and again and again in the book.
Can we invite a progressive staff?
I'm sorry, what?
Can we invite a progressive staff just in case any Black, Indigenous, or POC folks have a question first?
Oh, yeah, let's do that. Sure.
If, like, two here.
Hi. So this is kind of both addressed to both of you as an activist and a journalist. But I'm sort of wondering, like, UVA seems to have this weird way of not knowing whatever's happening around it. And I'm just like sort of wondering what you think accountability from UVA or even Charlottesville looks like that at this point. Is it like an apology to students, an apology to like Charlottesville residents? Like, how would they actually make it better if they were willing to acknowledge that they did something wrong?
The not knowing is convenient. There's a lot of not knowing, which the most charitable interpretation is, wow, you didn't know all of that? You really didn't know any of this stuff? And that's kind of alarming that you weren't aware. The more cynical perspective is a plausible deniability. Well, they didn't want to know, we weren't going to tell them so that they could deny having known. Either way, it's not good, especially as an institution tasked with caring for young people. As far as accountability goes, I might ask you that question.
Well, this summer of hate and, some of the failures of inaction, failure to act, sins of omission, it's called, really were the cause of a lot of soul searching at UVA, I have to say, after that. And I think with new leadership coming in almost exactly a year to the day, after the worst of the attacks, that there was some, prioritizing of, how to build, and improve relationships with the community, setting up, several different committees, commissions, this sort of thing, about 5, areas that had been identified by the community, areas of concern, among them, affordable housing and other things too. And so I think, UVA has, taken steps to have more of these relationships with the community to kind of ask, and kind of get input on, for instance, even the, placement, of affordable housing units and, this sort of thing. So that, definitely been an effort, the aspects of the Karsh Institute for Democracy, for instance, the Equity Project, or the Memory Project, and this sort of thing is, our work is, very much, I mean, I'm a part of this, to have relationships with the community to do this sort of work, sort of thing. Is it enough? No. UVA is, 200 years old, and for the first, 150 years of its existence, was basically for educating, elite white men, and so there's a, kind of a heft there, that the institution has had to, very self-consciously and deliberately, kind of turn toward something else, being a good neighbor. This is, kind of the goals, the institutional goals that, that UVA has set for itself. But there's a lot of work to be done, for sure. But yeah, but the aftermath of this, of Summer of Hate, really, it really shook UVA. And as far as, you kind of asked about apology or something like that. I mean, one of the first things that the new president, Jim Ryan, did was to apologize, to those students that were let down, that were attacked, on August the 11th, 2017, around the Thomas Jefferson statue in front of the rotunda, So there was some acknowledgement, of a failure. There's not, I would say, I'm surprised with this sometimes when I talk with my colleagues. There's not a lot of widespread knowledge there about kind of, what happened or didn't happen, in terms of UVA leadership that summer. So that's, one of the good things I think about this book, 24 Hours, is by having those in-depth interviews, with variously situated folks from UVA and the community, it kind of helps to flesh out the picture a bit more.
Nora, thank you very much for being here, and thank you very much for doing this book. I'm interested in the local people that you talk to, the activists and community members, and I wonder if there is, within the diversity of voices, there is something around which local people coalesced. Right, so you heard a variety of different kinds of perspectives, but was there a thing where local perspectives sort of came together? And if there was more than one, what were they? I'm also interested in where those local perspectives diverged.
I think one of the biggest points of divergence was what the proper response was to this coming to our town. There was conflicting wisdom being offered from, Julian in the book calls it the phalanx of the 4 Ps. The professors, politicians, police, and
Preachers.
Preachers. And professors, preachers, police, and politicians. Yes, the phalanx of the 4 Ps. On a very basic level, what should the Black community in Charlottesville do? Should they be showing up or should they not? And there was a disagreement over what the right thing to do was for all people in Charlottesville. Do we ignore it and not give them more oxygen? Do we show up and debate? And I think a lot of people now would have a different perspective on that than they did in 2017 before this. I think a lot of people thought the right thing to do was to ignore it and not go and not protest it. That may not still feel that way. But that was a big point of divergence that I saw. I think, the big coalescing point was the actual narrative of what happened. It was very clear. There was these couple of different skirmishes, that's the kind of the more policey word, but there was these brawls in the street, and everyone agrees with how those went for the most part, 5 years later with the benefit of documentation and things. But then the 4th Street crash was not I mean, I don't have to tell you all this in this town, but was not some culmination of the violence of the day in the way that people think it was. It was over. It was done. The activists had won. A lot of folks were up in McGuffey Art Park and were eating peanut butter sandwiches. Someone brought a paper mache inflatable Sally Hemings. And so there was that, there were balloons, it was this kind of more celebratory atmosphere. And this is all described in detail in the book. And I'm not going to go into too many details and re-traumatize you all right now. But the story of how that unfolded and the ways that the groups, there were two different groups of people, the way they merged, the decisions about what street they were going to go down, who was leading the different groups. No one's disputing the facts of how that happened. And that was interesting. I thought I was going to have a lot harder of a time reconstructing like the actual crash and the time around that. That was the easiest part. Everyone agrees with like what happened. I mean, what happened. And people have pretty clear memories of that.
Hi, I really found this very informative. The question I have is, if any, what role did Antifa and clergy have in making things more hostile?
It's I mean, that is a question that is asked. That is a question that is asked a lot, and I think it goes back to the point of what are we fighting for, and by allowing white nationalists or white supremacists to march on our streets unopposed, you have to make sure that that's, I mean, is that the message that you want to be sending? And so when you talk about Antifa and you talk about clergy, for example, people are going to fight back. And I think it is important to think about who started it, which I know sounds a little bit sophomoric, but the people who, the fighting back was being done after people were attacked and after people were assaulted and after people were already at a point of having violence done to them, for the most part, for almost entirely. And there's a discussion of this in the book that I would encourage you to read, this specific part of it. And what one of the clergy says and explains better than I can is this idea of nonviolence as a ethos for the way that we live our lives, and as a larger idea of nonviolence. And I'm trying to be careful with how I say this, because I think there is like a big question, and it goes back to the Trump thing of like violence on both sides. But I think the idea, like there are some clergy who are saying, look, we're going to be nonviolent until we are provoked, until we are attacked, and we will defend ourselves. And that happened. And there absolutely was defending going on. And there was fighting back and forth in the streets. But a lot of that was because people were not willing to leave their streets undefended. I'm not going to take a position on any of that. I think you can read the accounts in the book. But for many, many, many people in this community and in this country, there is another form of violence being perpetrated upon them. The lack of affordable housing in Charlottesville is a form of violence. The fact of literacy rates in this community, health outcomes in this community, the fact of our history and their lack of grappling with it in this community and in this country. For so many people, the status quo is violence. And so any conversation I'm not going to defend any acts of violence, but I'm saying that the conversation about violence and of who is doing what violence has to be broad enough to encompass all of those aspects. And I think there is a nuanced approach to that question in the book.
Awesome. Thank you again so much for, sorry, this is me.
Hi.
Should I stand? Thank you again for speaking. I just had a question about your oral history process, because I think that it would be valuable to talk about the difference, I guess, between reporting and your experience in reporting and then you conducting these oral history interviews and how you saw those differences, but and then what that process was and talking to these people who did experience very traumatic things, and the different, I guess the goal of a reporter to me is different than what an oral historian's goal is. So
I
yeah,
agree.
can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it comes down to the fact that as a journalist, I'm trying to like figure something out for the most part. I'm trying to hold someone to account. I'm often interviewing someone who is either a public figure or who has been thrust into the role of a public figure. I'm often having conversations with people who do have to answer my questions, or they don't have to, but then they're not going to like very much what's written. Whereas the power dynamic in oral history, I think, is very different. And I am letting people tell their own stories, and I am taking a bit of a step back and a bit of a back seat. I'm not trying to push the conversation in any given direction. Not that I'm doing that necessarily in journalism, except that sometimes people get off topic and, you know, a journalism interview lasts 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes for the most part. And these oral history interviews were days and days and sessions long. I mean, there were people I spoke to 5-6 times, which also then gave them time to reflect.
Thank you. So going back to the previous question and thinking about how we address combating fascism, I'm curious in your experience as a journalist covering even the Russian invasion of Ukraine, if there are discrepancies in how we as Americans consume media about combating fascism and how reporters write about it as well compared to an international context, and what we find acceptable here versus acceptable elsewhere, especially with regards to civilian action in combating fascism and violence.
Yeah. I was in Ukraine at the time when people were making Molotov cocktails, and there was this kind of almost like gleeful American attitude of like, wow, look at these Ukrainians making Molotov cocktails, like, wow, which, sure, and it's a little bit easier in that case to say Ukrainians have a right to defend their country, their sovereignty. But it's very different when it's our country. And what I mean by that is it feels different when it's home. There were some Ukrainian journalists that I was talking to in Ukraine who were talking about where that line is in terms of objectivity and then where that line is internationally. And that's something that we had a conversation. I was in a hotel with a lot of foreign journalists in Ukraine, and one of them at the end of a long day was like, this is the easiest war I've ever covered. It's so obvious. Like, you have a bad side and a good side. Like, let's all like get out, like go have a drink. Like, we're all done for the day. And I thought that was so interesting because, and this was my first war in person. But this idea that that was like an obvious war and with obvious sides made it somehow easier to cover. And that always sort of stuck with me. And I think in Charlottesville, especially in 2017, it got really complicated in how to cover this place that so many of us call home or have never set foot in ever in our lives, and with the national media that have come here. I don't know if that entirely answers the question. I think there's a lack of understanding of fascism in the United States and what that word means, what that is. there's a lack of understanding what being an anti-fascist looks like. There is Antifa as a group, and then there is the idea of being against fascism, which I would imagine many of us are not supporters of fascism. And so there's also a better understanding internationally of what that actually looks like. So I think it's hard sometimes to explain that and report at the same time.
You go.
We're gonna go there first.
She's already asked a
Yeah.
question.
Hey, thanks for doing this. One of the sort of near-term effects of what happened here in August 2017 was a lot of discrediting and embarrassment for both the alt-right and the right in general. Another medium-term effect was that a lot of people or some of the people who were here in the streets that day on the side of the Nazis ended up participating in January 6th. And now some of the people who were here, at least in a formative role, are back on social media and have been welcomed back by their friend Elon Musk and things like that. So what do you think now, 6 years later, is the legacy of the things that happened here in August 2017, and what do you think it will be going forward?
The direct line from August 12th to January 6th is a very short line. There are a lot of the same people at both. Someone was arrested this morning who was at both. I think, unfortunately, we are going to be confronted with questions of how to respond to the alt-right, the far right, the white nationalism again and again and again, and more often. Unfortunately, Charlottesville has become a recruiting tool, a propaganda tool. This was a success for them. And in terms of how they see it, right? They can spin anything to look like a success for them. But I think for me, it comes back to listening to organizers, listening to people who are trying to sound the alarm, who may be coming from less official capacities. And in the run-up to the future, trying to learn lessons from this. I wonder if you have thoughts on that.
Actually, that sounds like a great place to conclude this formal part of the discussion, I think, And I was going to say that we have here, New Dominion Books is here offering copies for sale of 24 Hours from Charlottesville right here in the cafe, where Nora will be signing copies, right? And I want to thank the Karsh Institute for Democracy, event staff. Thank you very much, Vivian Degens, there in the back, and so many others that helped here. I want to thank you, the audience, for coming and participating, in this conversation.
And I think before we all depart for a moment, Congregate is going to say a few words about our fundraiser for survivors.
We can hear from Congregate. Yeah, this is Reverend Chris Rivera and Jordan Leahy are here with us from Congregate.
Thank you. Thank you both for the witness that you're doing. So I'm Christina Rivera, she, her pronouns, and I am a religious educator, administrator, minister with the Unitarian Universalist Church of the Larger Fellowship. And I'm not going to give you a sermon. I'm not doing it. But we've heard a lot tonight. So I want to invite everybody just to take a minute to breathe however that is comfortable for you. In, out. If you need to stretch a bit, that's okay too. There's a lot that we heard tonight. The Summer of Hate of Charlottesville didn't begin with the events of 2017, and it didn't end with the events in August of 2017. but born out of that specific time and place is Congregate Charlottesville. It began with the Reverend Brittany Smash and Reverend Seth having conversations with clergy and lay leaders of many faith traditions about what to do. We knew it was coming, right? What do we do? And I want to say, like, that idea of having conversations sounds really polite, right? It wasn't. It was anything but polite. It was heated. There were conversations about theology, about how we show up, about what our responsibility is as people of faith to show up in the face of evil, because that's what that was. That's what that is. The racism that is embedded in the quote unquote American story is flat out evil. And so how do we show up, however you identify as a person of faith or not? What is your commitment to showing up in the face of that evil? I'm not going to go into the specifics of what Congregate did and didn't do. You need to read Nora's book for that. But what I want to give life to a little bit is about the vulnerable souls in Charlottesville. Because after the media leaves, after the reports are done, those souls remain. And it's our responsibility to take care of them. Congregate Charlottesville has done a lot of that since then. I'm not going to tell you all the things. It's a lot. We help grassroots organizations as their fiscal sponsorship. We've helped millions of dollars reach hands during COVID when people needed to eat. And throughout that, A11 and A12 survivors have known that Congregate is a place to come to when they need something, when they need the therapy bill paid, when they need the light bill paid, when they need to go to the movies. Little by little, we created the community support system and networks that we now call the A11, A12 Survive and Thrive Fund, because it's not just our responsibility to survive as Black and brown folks and people of targeted identities. It is our responsibility to thrive. And it is our responsibility for all of us to ensure that we are all thriving. The A11, A12 fund is very low barrier. If you do not know how to access it, go to congregatecville.org. You can find that on how to access both the fund and to give to the fund. You've got the very handy dandy QR code that is everywhere. Yeah, there it is. That is everywhere. I invite you to give generously to that. Or don't. I'm not here to ask you to make some kind of plea for your resources. Much the way that Seth and Smash led us in 2017, we will do this with you, or we will do this without you. But we will do it. We will survive and thrive. We fervently pray that with your support, but make no mistake, we're here for it. Spirit of life and love that comes into this community, we ask for your blessing on this work. Thank you. We ask for your blessing on these people. We ask for your blessing for this community. And we pray that your spirit of liberation and justice will shine out upon everyone here tonight and over the world, so that we can do the work ahead that frees us all. Thank you. Please give generously.